21 days ago, a war was launched with a clear and repeated objective: break the system that funds the enemy, cut the money, collapse the capability, force a result that could not be achieved through diplomacy. That objective was stated with confidence, repeated across every platform, reinforced in every briefing. The logic was simple: revenue fuels power, remove the revenue and the power weakens. And yet, what has unfolded since then tells a very different story. Because in the middle of this conflict, a decision was made that quietly reversed the core principle the war was built on. Not announced as a reversal, not framed as a shift, but executed in a way that changed the underlying math completely. Restrictions were eased. Barrels that were previously locked out of the global market were suddenly allowed to move. Buyers that had been warned away were now permitted to participate. And just like that, the flow of money that was supposed to be cut off began to open again. This is where the contradiction begins. Because you cannot fight war designed to eliminate revenue while simultaneously enabling that revenue to expand. You cannot argue that financial pressure is the primary weapon and then loosen that pressure at the exact moment it is supposed to matter most. The two actions do not balance each other, they cancel each other out. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to the foundation of the strategy itself. Economic pressure has always been about one thing: control access to money, limit the ability of a government to fund its operations, force difficult choices, create internal strain. Over time, that strain either produces negotiation or instability. But economic pressure only works if it is consistent. It only works if the restrictions are real. The moment exceptions are introduced, the system begins to weaken. Not because the logic disappears, but because the enforcement becomes selective, and selective enforcement creates opportunity. Opportunity for workarounds, opportunity for alternative routes, opportunity for the very system you are trying to restrict to adapt and survive. That is exactly what has happened here. For years, restricted oil did not disappear. It moved differently. It was sold at discounts. It was routed through intermediaries. It relied on complex networks designed to avoid detection and enforcement. The pressure reduced efficiency, but it did not eliminate activity. Now, with restrictions partially lifted, those inefficiencies begin to disappear. The same oil that was previously sold under constraints can now reach a broader market. More buyers means more competition. More competition means better prices. Better prices mean higher revenue. And here is the key point. The global price environment has changed at the same time. War disrupts supply. Disrupted supply drives prices higher. Higher prices increase the value of every available barrel. So the exact moment that access to markets expands is also the moment when those markets are paying the most. That combination is not neutral. It amplifies the outcome. What you end up with is a situation where the effort to control revenue is undermined by the conditions created by the war itself. The conflict raises prices. The policy allows sales. The result is increased income. Not reduced, increased. This is not a theoretical argument. It is basic arithmetic. If a country sells fewer barrels at a low price, revenue is limited. If it sells the same or greater volume at a higher price, revenue expands. And if access to buyers improves at the same time, the expansion accelerates. That is the loop that has formed. And once that loop begins, it becomes very difficult to reverse, because every attempt to stabilize the broader market pushes in the same direction. More supply is needed to control prices. But allowing more supply means allowing more revenue, and allowing more revenue contradicts the original objective. So policymakers face a choice. That is not really a choice at all. Accept higher prices and maintain pressure, or reduce pressure and accept the consequences. So far, the system has tried to do both, and that is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Because the market does not respond to intentions, it responds to actions. It responds to flows, volumes, and pricing. It responds to what is actually happening, not what was originally planned. And what is actually happening is this: supply has been disrupted, prices have increased, restrictions have been loosened, revenue is flowing. At the same time, the broader economic effects are beginning to appear. Energy costs feed into everything: transportation, manufacturing, food production, electricity generation. When energy becomes more expensive, everything that depends on it becomes more expensive. That pressure moves through the economy in layers, first at the wholesale level, then at the industrial level, then at the consumer level. Inflation rises, growth slows, governments intervene, but interventions that do not address the underlying supply problem can only do so much. You can release reserves, you can adjust policies, you can encourage production. But if a major supply route remains constrained, the imbalance persists. And that imbalance is what keeps prices elevated, which brings us back to the central contradiction. The original strategy was built on reducing financial capacity, but the current environment is increasing it, not intentionally but inevitably, because the system is interconnected. You cannot isolate one part of it without affecting the others. You cannot restrict supply in one area without influencing prices globally. And you cannot influence prices without affecting revenue for every producer in the market. That includes the very entity the strategy was designed to weaken. There is also a political dimension. That makes this even more complex. Policies are not judged only by their outcomes. They are judged by their consistency. When actions appear to contradict stated objectives, it becomes harder to maintain a clear narrative. And narrative matters. It shapes expectations. It influences markets. It affects alliances. It determines how decisions are interpreted both domestically and internationally. When a strategy begins to look internally inconsistent, confidence begins to erode, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, and in situations like this. Gradual erosion can be just as significant as sudden shocks, because uncertainty changes behavior. Investors become cautious. Governments hedge their positions. Companies delay decisions. The system becomes more defensive, less predictable. That unpredictability feeds back into the market. Prices become more volatile. Supply chains become less stable. The overall environment becomes harder to manage. All of this stems from a single issue: the gap between intention and outcome. The intention was to apply pressure. The outcome is a system where pressure and relief are being applied at the same time, not in sequence, not as part of a phased strategy, but simultaneously. And systems do not handle that kind of contradiction well. They amplify it. Every action taken to solve one problem creates movement in another direction. Every attempt to stabilize one variable destabilizes another. The result is a cycle that feeds on itself. Higher prices justify increased supply. Increased supply generates more revenue. More revenue undermines the pressure. Reduced pressure weakens the strategy. A weaker strategy prolongs the conflict. A prolonged conflict sustains the disruption, and sustained disruption keeps prices high. The loop closes. At that point, the question is no longer about individual decisions. It becomes about whether the overall approach can hold together under its own internal logic, because strategies are not just collections of actions, they are systems of cause and effect. And when those effects begin to contradict the original cause, the system starts to break down. That is where things stand now. A war launched to restrict financial power is operating in an environment that is increasing it. A policy built on consistency is being tested by exceptions. A strategy designed to simplify outcomes has created a more complex reality, and complexity is difficult to control, especially when it is driven by forces as fundamental as energy, markets, and global demand. The final question is not whether adjustments will be made. They will be. The system always adapts. The real question is whether those adjustments will resolve the contradiction or deepen it. Because as long as both sides of the equation continue to operate at the same time, pressure and relief, restriction and expansion, the outcome will remain the same. Not a clear strategy, but a system working against itself.